The Battle of Earth lasted 3 days and changed the galaxy forever. The Zephyrian Empire, faced with the rebellion of their own living weapons and an alliance they had never imagined possible, found their centuries of expansion crumbling in hours. Ship after ship fell as enslaved dragons broke free and turned against their captors, while the Allied fleet systematically dismantled the Empire's war machine. Magnus fought alongside his liberated kin with a ferocity born from 50 years of suppressed freedom. But even in the heat of battle, his thoughts kept returning to a small human boy who had shared his bread with a starving enemy. Every freed dragon, every liberated world, every family reunited was a testament to Tommy's simple act of compassion. When the last Zephyrian command ship surrendered, Magnus was among the first to land on Earth's surface. He touched down in the same ruined park where Tommy had found him, his massive form casting shadows across the broken concrete where their friendship had begun. The boy was there waiting, just as Magnus had hoped he would be. Tommy looked exactly the same, still small, still young, but with eyes that held the weight of everything he had accomplished. He stood fearlessly as Magnus approached, a smile spreading across his face. "I told you I'd help you get home," Tommy said simply. Magnus lowered his great head until he was eye level with the child who had changed his world. "You did more than that, young friend. You gave me back my soul, and through that gift you freed my entire people." Behind Magnus, other dragons were landing throughout the city. Families torn apart by decades of slavery were reuniting with cries of joy that echoed across the ruins. Celestia appeared at Magnus's side, her silver scales gleaming in the sunlight as she met the human child who had made their reunion possible. "So this is the famous Tommy," she said, her voice warm with gratitude. "My mate has told me much about you through our bond." "You carry the heart of a dragon, young one." Tommy blushed but stood tall under the praise. "I just did what anyone should do when they see someone who needs help." "That," Magnus rumbled, "is exactly why humans are so remarkable. Your species possesses something we dragons sometimes forget. In our long lives, the ability to see past differences and offer kindness without condition. The weeks that followed brought revelations that amazed both species. The Zephyrian Empire had fallen almost overnight as news of the dragon liberation spread. Without their enslaved weapons, the Empire's military might crumbled, and dozens of oppressed worlds declared independence. The galaxy was reshaping itself around principles of freedom and cooperation, rather than conquest and control. Tommy found himself at the center of it all, somehow becoming an unofficial ambassador between humans and dragons. He spent his days learning about dragon culture, technology, and history while teaching his new friends about human creativity, resilience, and the simple power of choosing to care about others. The collar-breaking technology he had helped develop became the foundation for new medical devices that could heal both species. Dragon biotechnology, freely shared for the first time, revolutionized human medicine and agriculture. The partnership between the two peoples grew stronger with each passing day. Magnus never returned to the war. Instead, he chose to remain on Earth, helping to build the new alliance between their species. He and Celestia made their home in the restored park where everything had begun, creating a garden that bloomed with flowers from both worlds. Tommy visited them every day, usually bringing some small gift, a new book to share, an interesting piece of technology to discuss, or simply stories about his day. The boy had become the living symbol of what their alliance could accomplish when beings chose cooperation over conflict. On the first anniversary of their meeting, Tommy sat beside Magnus in their garden, sharing lunch as they had done so many times before. The dragon had grown sleek and healthy again, his scales once more gleaming with their natural luster. But more importantly, his eyes held the peace of a being who had found his place in the universe. "Do you ever regret it?" Tommy asked quietly. "Staying here instead of going back to your homeworld?" Magnus considered the question seriously before responding. "Dracosia will always be the world of my birth," he said. "But Earth has become the world of my choice. Here I learned that home is not just a place. It is the people who care about you and whom you care about in return." Tommy smiled at that, leaning back against Magnus's warm side as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Around them, the garden bloomed with impossible beauty. Human roses growing beside draconic crystal flowers, creating something entirely new and wonderful. Besides, Magnus added with the rumbling sound that Tommy now knew was dragon laughter. "Someone needs to make sure you stay out of trouble. You have a dangerous habit of befriending creatures that could eat you." "It worked out pretty well this time," Tommy pointed out. "Indeed it did, my young friend. Indeed it did." As the stars came out above them, dragon and human sat together in comfortable silence, each grateful for the moment of hunger and kindness that had changed everything. The galaxy was vast and full of wonders they had yet to discover, but they faced that future together, proof that the greatest strength in the universe was not in weapons or technology, but in the simple choice to see the person behind the enemy and offer them hope instead of hatred. The revolution that freed the dragons had begun with a single act of compassion. The peace that followed would be built on millions more, as two species learned that their differences made them stronger when they chose to stand together rather than apart. In the end, the most powerful force in the galaxy turned out to be the same thing it had always been: one person choosing to care about another, regardless of what species they happened to be. The moment arrived during the ship's deepest sleep cycle, when most of the Zephyrian crew was in their regeneration chambers. Magnus and his allies had positioned themselves throughout the holding bays, their makeshift liberation device hidden within the ship's own power distribution network. One by one, they activated the components Tommy's knowledge had made possible. The cascade began as a whisper of electronic interference in the collar control systems. Magnus watched as status lights flickered throughout the vast chamber, the Empire's perfect technology beginning to stumble over the impossible feedback loops the dragons had created. The control network tried to compensate, routing power through backup systems, but every adjustment only made the problem worse. Then, in a moment that would be remembered in dragon history forever, every collar on the ship went dark simultaneously. The silence that followed was profound. Hundreds of dragons stood in stunned disbelief as the weight of 50 years of mental oppression lifted from their minds. Some collapsed, overwhelmed by the sudden return of free will. Others roared with primal joy, their voices shaking the ship's hull. Magnus felt tears streaming down his scaled cheeks as memories he had thought lost forever came flooding back. "Brothers, sisters," Starfire's ancient voice boomed across the chamber. "Today we reclaim our dignity. Today we choose our own path." The dragons moved with deadly efficiency born from decades of enforced military training, but now they fought for themselves rather than their captors. Magnus led a strike team toward the ship's bridge while Thunderwing secured the weapons systems. Other groups moved to take control of communications, life support, and the prison blocks where human captives were held. The Zephyrian crew, roused by emergency alarms, found themselves facing an enemy they had never prepared for. Their own weapons turned against them. The dragons knew every weakness in the ship's design, every blind spot in its defenses. They had been forced to study these systems for decades, and now that knowledge became their greatest advantage. Magnus crashed through the bridge's armored doors like a living missile, his massive form filling the command center. The Zephyrian captain, a veteran commander who had conquered dozens of worlds, stood frozen in terror as he faced the impossible. A free dragon, uncontrolled and uncontrollable. "You enslaved my people," Magnus growled, his voice carrying the weight of 50 years of suppressed rage. "You stole our children, broke our spirits, forced us to commit atrocities in your name. But you made one critical error." The captain reached for his weapon, but Magnus was faster. A single swipe of the dragon's claw sent the alien flying across the bridge, his armor cracking against the wall. "You underestimated the power of hope," Magnus continued, settling his massive bulk in front of the ship's main controls. "And you never understood the strength that comes from friendship freely given." Throughout the command ship, similar scenes played out as dragons reclaimed their freedom. The Zephyrian Empire's greatest weapons had become their greatest enemies in the space of minutes. But Magnus knew this was only the beginning. Other ships in the fleet still held thousands of enslaved dragons, and the Empire would not give up their living weapons without a fight. As if summoned by his thoughts, the bridge's communication system crackled to life. The voice that emerged spoke in the clicking language of the Zephyrians, but it was translated automatically by the ship's systems. "Command vessel. Respond immediately. Long-range sensors detect unknown fleet approaching Earth system. Confirm dragon weapon status." Magnus smiled, his sharp teeth gleaming in the bridge's emergency lighting. He keyed the communication system, responding in perfect Zephyrian. "This is Magnus of Dracosia, speaking for the free dragons of this vessel. Your weapons are no longer yours to command. The silence that followed was heavy with shock and disbelief. Then a different voice came through the speakers, older, more authoritative. Impossible. Dragon neural conditioning cannot be overcome. You lie. Then come and see for yourself, Magnus challenged. But know this, we are no longer your slaves. We remember our names, our families, our homeworld, and we will never serve you again. The communication cut off abruptly, but Magnus knew the Empire would respond quickly. Other ships in the fleet would be checking their own dragon populations, increasing security, perhaps even beginning emergency collar replacements. They had minutes before the counterattack began, but those minutes were enough. Across the galaxy, the message Magnus had sent was being received by resistance movements on dozens of worlds. Tommy's simple act of kindness had created ripples that were now becoming waves of revolution. On distant planets, enslaved dragons were learning that freedom was possible. Human colonies were discovering that their greatest enemies might actually be their most powerful allies. The command ship's sensors lit up with incoming contacts. The allied fleet Tommy had somehow assembled was dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the solar system. Magnus watched in amazement as the tactical display showed ships from a dozen different species, all united by the simple principle that no thinking being should be enslaved. At the center of the fleet flew a ship Magnus recognized, a dragon vessel from the outer systems, one of the few free colonies that had escaped the Empire's expansion. Somehow, impossibly, Tommy had made contact with Magnus's own people and convinced them to risk everything in a rescue mission. Attention Zephyrian forces, came a new transmission, broadcast on all frequencies. This is Admiral Celestia of the Free Dragon Coalition. You are ordered to release all enslaved dragons immediately and withdraw from Earth space. Magnus felt his heart stop. Celestia, his mate, his beloved, somehow alive and free and leading a rescue fleet. The Empire had told him she was dead, killed during his capture 50 years ago. It had been another lie, another tool of control. The dragon commander's voice shook with emotion as he responded. Celestia, my starfire, is it truly you? It is I, my beloved, came the reply, and Magnus could hear tears in her voice across the vast distance of space. A human child reached out to our colonies with tales of your courage and a message of hope. He showed us how to break the Empire's chains and gave us the location of their fleet. We have come to bring our people home. Magnus looked out at the approaching fleet, then back at the freed dragons filling his ship's corridors. Tommy had done the impossible. He had turned a moment of simple kindness into a galactic revolution. One small boy with a piece of bread had changed the course of history. The final battle for freedom was about to begin. But Magnus no longer feared the outcome. They had something the Empire could never understand or overcome, the power of beings who chose to fight for each other rather than being forced to fight for masters who saw them only as tools. The revolution had begun with a hungry dragon and a compassionate child. Now it would end with the liberation of an entire species and the fall of an empire built on cruelty and control. Magnus found himself in the vast holding bay of the command ship, surrounded by hundreds of his own kind. Dragons of every size and color filled the enormous space, their scales dulled by captivity and their eyes empty of hope. The familiar red glow of control collars painted everything in hellish light, a constant reminder of their enslavement. The dragon had been here before, many times over the decades, but now he saw it with new eyes. These weren't weapons or tools. They were people, individuals with families and dreams who had been stolen from their homes and forced to serve an empire they had never chosen to join. Magnus felt a surge of rage that he carefully suppressed, maintaining the facade of obedient compliance that would keep him alive. He was assigned to Bay 7, a section housing the heavy assault dragons used for ground operations. His supposed injuries earned him a few days of rest before he would be expected to return to active duty. This gave Magnus the time he needed to carefully observe the security systems and begin making contact with potential allies. The first dragon he approached was Thunderwing, a massive blue-scaled female who had been captured from the same raid that took Magnus 50 years ago. She lay in the mechanical torpor that long captivity induced, her powerful limbs shackled with energy restraints. "Sister," Magnus whispered in the ancient draconic tongue, positioning himself so the surveillance cameras couldn't detect his lip movements. "Do you remember the thermal caves of our homeworld?" Thunderwing's eyes flickered with momentary confusion. then widened as recognition dawned. The Empire's mind conditioning was designed to suppress personal memories, but Magnus had found that certain triggers could break through the mental barriers. References to their homeworld, to family, to the life they had known before. These could sometimes pierce the artificial fog that clouded their thoughts. "Magnus?" She breathed, her voice barely audible. "You speak as one who remembers. But that is impossible. The conditioning can be broken," Magnus whispered back. "I have learned this from an unlikely teacher, a human youngling who showed me that freedom is still possible." Over the next several hours, Magnus carefully shared his story with Thunderwing, watching as the spark of hope slowly rekindled in her ancient eyes. He told her about Tommy's kindness, about the collar-breaking device, about the possibility of turning their captivity into liberation. Thunderwing listened with growing amazement and terror. "If the Empire discovers what you speak of—" "They will not," Magnus assured her. "But we must be careful. Choose only those you trust absolutely. We will spread the knowledge slowly, like seeds in fertile ground." Word began to spread through the dragon population with the subtle efficiency of creatures who had learned to communicate under constant surveillance. Magnus shared the techniques Tommy had taught him about electronics and frequency manipulation. Other dragons contributed their own knowledge, security protocols they had observed, weaknesses in the ship's systems, guard rotation schedules they had memorized during their decades of service. The breakthrough came when Magnus made contact with Starfire, an ancient red dragon who had been the Empire's prize weapon for over a century. Unlike the others, Starfire had retained more of his original personality through sheer force of will, though he had never dared to show it. "I have been waiting for this day since my capture," Starfire rumbled quietly as they stood together in the ship's exercise chamber. "I remember everything. My mate, my children, the day the sky burned with alien fire. But I also remember something else. I remember the location of the Empire's main dragon breeding facility." Magnus felt his heart skip a beat. "How many?" "Thousands," Starfire replied. "Younglings who have never known freedom, born into slavery and conditioned from hatching to serve without question. If we could reach them, we could free an entire generation," Magnus finished. "But first we must free ourselves." The plan they developed was audacious in its simplicity. Using the knowledge Tommy had taught him, Magnus would create a cascade failure in the ship's collar control system. Instead of trying to free the dragons one at a time, they would disable the entire network simultaneously. The risk was enormous. If they failed, every dragon on the ship would die instantly as the failsafes activated. But Magnus had learned something important from his young human friend. Sometimes the greatest courage came from the smallest acts of kindness. Tommy had risked everything to feed a starving enemy, and that simple gesture had created possibilities no one could have imagined. Working in secret during the ship's sleep cycle, Magnus and his allies began constructing their liberation device. They scavenged components from damaged equipment, salvaged circuits from their own restraints, and used their natural bioelectric abilities to power systems the Empire never intended for dragon use. The work was painstakingly slow and dangerous. Each component had to be hidden perfectly, each connection made without triggering security alerts. Magnus found himself thinking often of Tommy during these long nights, drawing strength from the memory of the boy's unwavering determination to help a creature he had every reason to fear. As they neared completion of their device, Magnus began preparing the other dragons for what was to come. Not all of them could handle the truth. Some had been broken too thoroughly by decades of conditioning. But those who could remember, who could hope, began to organize themselves into cells of resistance. They would need to move quickly once the collars were disabled. The ship's crew would react within minutes, and the dragons would have only a brief window to seize control before reinforcements arrived. But Magnus had spent 50 years studying the Empire's tactics and weaknesses. He knew exactly where to strike for maximum effect. The night before their planned liberation, Magnus received an unexpected communication through the ship's internal systems. It was a message hidden in routine maintenance data, encoded in a way that only someone with knowledge of human electronics would recognize. The message was from Tommy. "Help is coming," it read. "Human resistance forces have allied with free dragon populations from the outer systems. Fleet approaching Earth in 3 days. Be ready." Magnus felt a surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm his careful control. The boy had done more than just free one dragon. He had somehow managed to forge an alliance between their species. The impossible was becoming possible, and it all started with a piece of bread offered to a starving enemy. As Magnus prepared for the most important battle of his long life, he made a silent promise to the human child who had changed everything. When this was over, when both their peoples were free, he would find Tommy again and show him the world that his courage had made possible. The Zephyrian search party arrived exactly 36 hours later, just as Magnus had predicted. Tommy watched from his hiding place behind a collapsed wall as 3 hovercraft descended into the ruined park, their blue engines humming with alien technology. Each craft carried a squad of Zephyrian soldiers, tall, slender beings with pale green skin and large black eyes that seemed to absorb light. Magnus lay exactly where Tommy had found him days earlier, appearing wounded and exhausted. The deactivated collar had been carefully repositioned to look functional, its surface scratched and dented to suggest damage from whatever battle had supposedly injured the dragon. Tommy's makeshift electronic device was hidden beneath debris, ready to activate at a moment's notice. The lead Zephyrian officer, distinguishable by the elaborate crest on his armor, approached Magnus with obvious irritation. He spoke in the harsh, clicking language of his species, gesturing angrily at the dragon's supposed condition. Tommy couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. The officer was berating Magnus for losing contact and getting injured. Magnus responded with submissive body language, keeping his head low and making the soft whimpering sounds Tommy had heard when they first met. The performance was flawless, giving no indication that the dragon was anything other than a defeated, obedient weapon awaiting orders. The officer pulled out a handheld device and aimed it at Magnus's collar. Tommy held his breath as alien scanners probed the control system. This was the critical moment. If the Zephyrians detected the tampering, the plan would fail catastrophically. But Magnus had been right about the Empire's overconfidence. The scanner showed exactly what the officer expected to see: a damaged but functional control collar on an injured but obedient dragon. The Zephyrian made notes on his device, then spoke sharply to his subordinates. 2 soldiers approached Magnus with what looked like medical equipment. They began tending to the dragon's supposedly real wounds, applying healing gel and biostimulants that would accelerate recovery. Tommy watched in fascination as the alien medicine worked, genuinely healing the minor cuts and bruises Magnus had acquired during his time in the ruins. The process took nearly an hour, during which Tommy remained perfectly still in his hiding place. He could see Magnus's eyes occasionally flick in his direction, maintaining their secret communication even under the watchful gaze of their enemies. Finally, the medical treatment was complete. The lead officer stepped back and raised his device again, this time aiming it directly at Magnus's head. Tommy realized with horror that this was some kind of neural scanner, designed to probe the dragon's mind for memories of what had happened during his absence. This was the moment Magnus had warned him about: the Empire's standard procedure for recovering lost assets. The scanner would reveal everything if Magnus's mind wasn't properly prepared, but the dragon had spent days using meditation techniques from his homeworld to compartmentalize his thoughts, hiding his true memories behind barriers of false recollections. The scanner hummed to life, bathing Magnus's head in pale blue light. Tommy watched tensely as the officer studied the readouts, his alien features unreadable. Long minutes passed as the device probed deeper, searching for any sign of tampering or rebellion. Magnus remained perfectly still, his breathing shallow and controlled. Tommy could only imagine the mental discipline required to maintain such deception, while alien technology invaded his thoughts. The dragon was essentially lying to a mind reader, using techniques that had taken him decades to master. Finally, the officer lowered his scanner, apparently satisfied with what he had found. The false memories Magnus had constructed told a convincing story: a battle with human resistance fighters, an explosion that damaged his collar and caused amnesia, days of wandering confused through the ruins until the search party found him. The officer made more notes, then gestured to his soldiers. They began preparing Magnus for transport, attaching guide cables to his limbs and positioning anti-gravity lifters beneath his massive form. Tommy realized with growing excitement that the plan was actually working. The Zephyrians were taking Magnus exactly where they wanted to go. As the dragon was loaded into the largest hovercraft, he managed one last glance toward Tommy's hiding place. Their eyes met for just an instant, and Tommy saw something in Magnus's gaze that filled him with hope. A promise that this was not goodbye, but the beginning of something much larger. The hovercrafts lifted off with their precious cargo, disappearing into the cloudy sky toward the massive Zephyrian command ship that orbited Earth like a mechanical moon. Tommy waited until they were completely out of sight before emerging from his hiding place. His heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Magnus was now inside the Empire's most secure facility, surrounded by thousands of enslaved dragons and their alien masters. But he carried with him something the Zephyrians had never encountered before: the knowledge of how to break their control collars, and more importantly, the unshakable belief that freedom was possible. Tommy gathered his equipment and began the long journey back to the underground tunnels where the other survivors waited. He had work to do: resistance cells to contact, plans to coordinate, and most importantly, more collar-breaking devices to build. Magnus would need help from the inside, and Tommy intended to make sure he got it. The boy looked up at the sky one last time, knowing that somewhere above the clouds his friend was beginning the most dangerous mission in galactic history. Magnus wasn't just trying to free himself anymore. He was preparing to liberate an entire species and turn the Empire's greatest weapon against them. The real war for Earth was about to begin, and it would be fought not with human weapons, but with something far more powerful: the simple recognition that every thinking being deserved to be free. The device hummed to life with a soft electronic whine that made both Tommy and Magnus tense. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then the red light on the collar began to flicker, its steady pulse becoming erratic. Magnus's eyes widened, and he made a sound Tommy had never heard before, something between a roar and a song. "It's working," Tommy breathed, watching the readouts on his salvaged equipment. The collar's control signals were becoming confused, unable to distinguish between its own commands and the false feedback Tommy's device was generating. Slowly, carefully, the boy adjusted the frequency, gradually weakening the collar's hold on Magnus's mind. The process took hours. Tommy had to constantly monitor the biorhythm feedback, making tiny adjustments to ensure the collar didn't detect the tampering. Magnus remained perfectly still throughout the procedure, trusting the human boy with his life. Sweat dripped from Tommy's forehead as he worked, knowing that one wrong calculation could kill his friend instantly. As the afternoon wore on, Tommy noticed changes in Magnus. The dragon's posture became more relaxed, and his eyes seemed brighter, more alert. The constant low-level pain that had been visible in every movement began to fade. When Magnus turned his head to look at something in the distance, it was with the fluid grace of a creature born to fly, not the mechanical stiffness of a controlled weapon. Finally, as the sun began to set, the red light on the collar flickered one last time and went dark. The device powered down with a mechanical sigh, its control circuits completely overwhelmed by Tommy's feedback loop. Magnus lifted his great head and let out a sound that shook the ruins around them. Not a roar of rage or pain, but a song of pure joy and freedom. Tommy fell backward, exhausted, but triumphant. "You're free," he whispered. "You're actually free." Magnus lowered his massive head and gently nuzzled Tommy's shoulder, a gesture of gratitude that needed no translation. Then the dragon did something that amazed the boy even more. He began to speak, his voice deep and resonant, forming words in heavily accented but unmistakable English. "Thank you, young Tommy," Magnus said, his vocal cords adapting to human speech with the same incredible flexibility that had allowed him to survive in captivity for decades. "You have given me back my soul." Tommy stared in shock. "You can talk? You could always talk?" "The collar prevented speech," Magnus explained, his voice growing stronger with each word. "It blocked all forms of communication except what the Empire required for battle commands. For 50 years I have been trapped in silence, unable to express my thoughts, my pain, my longing for home. The dragon's revelation opened floodgates of communication." Magnus told Tommy about his homeworld, Dracosia, a planet of crystal caves and thermal vents where dragons lived in harmony with their environment. He spoke of his family, his mate Celestia, and their 3 younglings who had been born just before his capture. He described the day the Zephyrian Empire arrived, using advanced technology to overwhelm the dragon's natural defenses and enslave them for their war machine. But how many of you are there? Tommy asked, his mind racing with possibilities. How many dragons are still enslaved? Magnus's expression darkened.
Thousands, he said.
Scattered across the Empire's fleet, used as living weapons against worlds that have never harmed us. Each one collared, controlled, forced to commit atrocities against their will. Tommy felt a surge of determination. Then we have to free them all. Magnus looked at the boy with surprise and something that might have been admiration. You speak of freeing thousands of dragons as if it were possible for one small human to accomplish. Not just me, Tommy said, standing up and pacing among the ruins. There are others. Humans hiding in the tunnels, resistance fighters in the mountains. If we can prove that the dragons are enslaved, if we can show people how to break the collars, we can turn your own people against the Empire. The dragon considered this, his amber eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight. The Empire would not expect such a strategy. They believe humans are too primitive to understand our technology, too weak to pose any real threat. That's their mistake, Tommy said with a grin. Humans are really good at thinking outside the box, especially when we're desperate. Magnus nodded slowly. There is something else you should know. The collar contained a tracking device. Its deactivation will not go unnoticed for long. The Empire will send search parties to investigate. Tommy felt a chill of fear, but it was overshadowed by excitement. How long do we have? Perhaps a day, maybe two, before they organize a proper search. But Tommy? Magnus paused, his great head tilting thoughtfully. I have an idea that might serve our cause better than simply running away. The dragon's eyes gleamed with an intelligence that had been suppressed for half a century, now finally free to express itself. What if, instead of hiding from the search party, we allowed them to find us? Tommy frowned. That sounds like suicide. Not if they find exactly what we want them to find, Magnus said, a smile playing around his massive jaws. The Empire's greatest weakness is their absolute confidence in their control systems. They believe their technology is infallible, their slaves perfectly obedient. What if we use that arrogance against them? As Magnus explained his plan, Tommy felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration. It was incredibly dangerous, requiring split-second timing and absolute trust between them. But if it worked, it would do more than just save one dragon. It would plant the seeds of rebellion throughout the Empire's entire slave army. Are you sure about this? Tommy asked when Magnus finished outlining the strategy. The dragon's response was a low rumble that Tommy now recognized as laughter. Young human, I have been dreaming of revenge for 50 years. Now with your help, that dream becomes possibility. Tommy spent the next 3 days bringing food to the dragon, whom he had started calling Magnus because of the creature's massive size. Each morning, the boy would venture out to scavenge whatever he could find. Expired canned goods from destroyed stores, fruit from abandoned gardens, even catching fish from the polluted river that ran through the city. The dragon's condition slowly improved with each meal, though Tommy noticed that Magnus seemed to survive on remarkably little food for such a large creature. The boy suspected that the dragons had been genetically modified for efficiency, designed to be living weapons that required minimal resources. It made the Zephyrian Empire's strategy even more terrifying. They could deploy these creatures anywhere without worrying about supply lines. On the 4th day, Tommy arrived to find Magnus attempting to stand. The dragon's movements were shaky, but there was new strength in those amber eyes. The wounds on its hide had begun to heal, revealing the incredible regenerative abilities of its species. Tommy watched in amazement as scales that had been torn away slowly regrew, returning the creature's hide to its original lustrous appearance. You're getting better, Tommy said, settling down beside Magnus with his daily offering. A can of peaches he had managed to open with his pocket knife. The dragon accepted the food gratefully, then did something unexpected. It extended one massive claw and began drawing in the dirt. Tommy leaned closer, fascinated. Magnus was creating symbols, not human letters, but complex geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with meaning. The dragon drew what looked like a star map, then pointed to a specific cluster of symbols before touching its collar with obvious distress. That's where you're from? Tommy asked, pointing to the star pattern. Magnus nodded, then drew another set of symbols that looked like chains breaking. The message was clear. The dragon wanted to go home, to be free from the control collar that enslaved it. Over the following days, Magnus began teaching Tommy the basics of draconic writing. The boy had always been quick with languages, and the dragon's patient instruction helped him understand that there was an entire civilization of these creatures somewhere among the stars. Magnus showed him symbols for family, for freedom, for home, concepts that transcended species barriers. Tommy learned that Magnus had been captured as a youngling, ripped away from its family and forced to serve the Zephyrian Empire for over 50 Earth years. The control collar not only compelled obedience, but also caused constant pain, a cruel reminder of the dragon's captivity. Magnus had been bred in the Empire's war factories, trained to destroy worlds he had never seen, to fight battles he didn't understand. The revelation filled Tommy with anger and determination. He began studying the collar more closely, noting its construction and the way the red light pulsed in rhythm with Magnus's heartbeat. The device was clearly advanced technology, but Tommy had spent years tinkering with electronics before the invasion. His father had been an engineer, and he had taught Tommy the basics of circuitry and programming. "I think I can help you," Tommy told Magnus one evening as they sat together watching the sunset paint the ruined city in shades of gold and crimson. "But I'll need tools, and I'll need to understand how this thing works." Magnus drew more symbols in the dirt, a warning. The collar was designed with fail-safes. If tampered with incorrectly, it would kill the dragon instantly. But there was something else in the symbols, a message of hope. Magnus believed that Tommy's young, unmodified human mind might be able to see solutions that the Empire's designers had never considered. That night, Tommy made his way to the ruins of the university's engineering building. The structure had been partially collapsed during the invasion, but the basement laboratories were still accessible. He spent hours gathering components, circuit boards, wire, diagnostic equipment that had survived the destruction. His plan was ambitious and dangerous, but it was the only chance Magnus had for freedom. When Tommy returned to the park the next morning, he found Magnus waiting expectantly. The dragon had used its claws to clear a large workspace in the dirt, creating a makeshift laboratory among the ruins. Tommy spread out his salvaged equipment, explaining his plan in the mixture of English and draconic symbols they had developed for communication. The collar operated on multiple frequency bands, constantly monitoring Magnus's vital signs and neural activity. But Tommy had noticed something the Empire's engineers had overlooked. The device had to synchronize with Magnus's natural biorhythms to function properly. If he could create a feedback loop, essentially making the collar think Magnus was already perfectly obedient, he might be able to gradually reduce its control without triggering the fail-safes. Magnus watched intently as Tommy worked, occasionally offering guidance through their shared symbol system. The dragon's knowledge of the collar's construction, combined with Tommy's intuitive understanding of electronics, created a partnership that neither the Empire nor the dragon's original captors could have anticipated. As the sun reached its zenith, Tommy made the final connection to his improvised device. He looked up at Magnus, whose amber eyes reflected both hope and terror. They both knew that if this failed, it would mean Magnus's death. "Ready?" Tommy whispered. Magnus nodded slowly, lowering his great head so Tommy could attach the device to the collar. The boy's hands shook as he made the connection, knowing that he held the life of his friend in his small human fingers. Tommy walked through the ruins of New Geneva, his backpack heavy with the day's scavenged food. The 12-year-old boy had learned to move quietly through the debris-filled streets, avoiding the patrol drones that still swept the abandoned city. 3 months had passed since the Zephyrian Empire conquered Earth, and most humans had either fled to the underground bunkers or been taken to the work camps. The morning sun cast long shadows between the collapsed buildings as Tommy made his way toward the old park. His stomach growled, reminding him that he had given his last protein bar to Mrs. Chen yesterday. The elderly woman was hiding in the subway tunnels with her granddaughter, and Tommy couldn't bear to see the little girl cry from hunger. As he rounded the corner near the fountain, Tommy froze. Something massive lay crumpled beside the broken concrete benches. At first he thought it might be debris from another building collapse, but then he saw it move. The creature was enormous, easily the size of a small aircraft, with scales that shimmered like oil on water. Its wings were torn and bloodied, folded awkwardly against its serpentine body. Tommy had seen pictures of Zephyrian battle dragons in the old news broadcasts before the communications went dark. This was definitely one of them. The apex predators that had helped the alien empire crush Earth's military forces in just 2 weeks. The boy's first instinct was to run, but something made him pause. The dragon's massive head was turned toward him, and its eyes, deep amber orbs larger than dinner plates, held an expression Tommy had never expected to see from one of Earth's conquerors. The creature looked exhausted, defeated, and desperately hungry. Its sides heaved with labored breathing, and dark purple blood seeped from multiple wounds across its hide. Tommy took a cautious step closer, his hand instinctively reaching for the piece of bread in his jacket pocket. He had been saving it for dinner, but something about the dragon's pitiful state made him reconsider. The creature made a low, rumbling sound that seemed more like a whimper than a roar. "Are you hurt?" Tommy whispered, feeling foolish for talking to what was essentially a living weapon, but the dragon's head lifted slightly at the sound of his voice, and those ancient eyes focused on him with surprising intelligence. The boy pulled out the bread, a small, stale roll he had found in an abandoned bakery. It wasn't much, barely enough for one meal, but it was all he had. Tommy held it out toward the dragon, his hand trembling slightly. "Are you hungry?" The massive creature stared at the offering for a long moment, then slowly lowered its great head toward Tommy's outstretched hand. Its nostrils flared, taking in the scent of the bread, and the boy could feel warm breath washing over him. Up close he could see that the dragon's scales were dulled with pain and exhaustion, and several deep gashes marked its neck and shoulders. With surprising gentleness, the dragon took the bread from Tommy's palm, its movements careful not to harm the small human. The creature swallowed the morsel in one gulp, then looked back at Tommy with what seemed like gratitude. The boy couldn't believe what he was doing, feeding one of the creatures that had helped destroy his world. But something about this moment felt right. Tommy sat down on a nearby chunk of concrete, studying the wounded dragon. "What happened to you?" he asked softly. "Did you get in a fight with other dragons?" The creature made another low sound, almost like it was trying to communicate. Its tail, which stretched behind it like a massive anaconda, twitched weakly. Tommy noticed that the dragon wore a collar around its neck, a metallic band that pulsed with a faint red light. There were scorch marks around the collar, as if someone had tried to remove it. "You're a prisoner too, aren't you?" Tommy realized aloud. "They're controlling you with that thing." The dragon's eyes widened and it made a more urgent sound, nodding its massive head. Tommy felt a chill run down his spine as he understood the implications. These dragons weren't willing participants. In the invasion, they were enslaved, forced to fight against their will. The boy looked around nervously, knowing that Zephyrian search parties would eventually come looking for their missing weapon. But he couldn't just leave the creature here to suffer. Against all logic and self-preservation, Tommy found himself making a decision that would change everything. "I'll help you," he whispered to the dragon. "I don't know how, but I'll find a way." The dragon's amber eyes seemed to shine with hope, and it lowered its head until it was resting on the ground near Tommy's feet. The boy reached out hesitantly and touched one of the massive scales on the creature's snout. It was warm and surprisingly smooth, like polished stone. As Tommy sat beside the wounded dragon in the ruins of his city, he had no idea that this moment of compassion would spark a chain of events that would not only save both their lives, but ultimately free an entire species from slavery and turn the tide of the war for Earth's survival.